March 28, 1979. A teenage girl studies alone in her kitchen, doors unlocked, trusting in small-town safety. By sunset, she's dead, a knife in her back. No witnesses, no forced entry, no answers. For 45 years, her killer walks free while her family counts endless birthdays she'll never see. But in 2024, a microscopic trace of DNA, smaller than a grain of sand, whispers the truth that time tried to bury. One name, one match, one reckoning decades in the making. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of the Brannigan house on Pinetop Trail, casting gentle shadows across Holly's textbooks. March 28, 1979, felt like any other Wednesday in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The 17-year-old spread her homework across the kitchen table, preparing for upcoming exams. Her auburn hair caught the light as she leaned over chemistry notes, completely absorbed in her studies. Outside, neighbors went about their routines. Mrs. Henderson tended her garden next door. Children played hopscotch on the sidewalk. The Brannigan house stood as it always had, doors unlocked, windows open to the spring breeze. This was small-town America at its most trusting, where safety was assumed and fear had no address. Holly's parents had left for work that morning, kissing her goodbye as they did every day. Her brother was at college. The house belonged to Holly and her dreams of graduation, of college applications, of a future that stretched endlessly ahead. She hummed softly as she worked, occasionally glancing at the clock. They'd be home for dinner in a few hours. The afternoon light began to fade as storm clouds gathered overhead. Holly gathered her books, stacking them neatly for tomorrow's classes. She moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, opening the refrigerator to see what she might prepare for dinner. The house remained peaceful, wrapped in the kind of silence that speaks of safety and routine. But in small towns, silence can shatter in an instant. The Brannigan family's car pulled into the driveway at 6:30 p.m., headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Holly's mother carried groceries from the afternoon shopping trip, while her father fumbled with his keys at the front door. They expected to find Holly at the kitchen table, homework spread before her, ready to tell them about her day. Instead, they found horror. Holly lay motionless on the kitchen floor, a knife embedded in her back. Blood had pooled beneath her body, staining the linoleum tiles that her mother had mopped just that morning. The groceries fell from trembling hands as screams pierced the suburban quiet. Within minutes, Pinetop Trail transformed from peaceful neighborhood to crime scene. Red and blue lights painted the houses in alternating waves of color. Police cars lined the street as officers cordoned off the Brannigan property with yellow tape. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion, their faces etched with disbelief. Detective Johnson arrived as the first responders secured the scene. He'd worked dozens of cases in his 20-year career, but the sight of Holly so young, so innocent, struck him with unusual force. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no screams heard by neighbors. The killer had moved through this house like a ghost, leaving only death in their wake. As news crews arrived and camera lights illuminated the tragedy, one question echoed through every conversation. Who killed Holly Brannigan? The answer would remain hidden for nearly 5 decades. By midnight, the Brannigan house had become a cathedral of investigation. Photographers documented every angle of the crime scene, their flashes creating stark contrast between light and shadow. The kitchen, once filled with the warmth of family dinners, now bore the clinical attention of forensic analysis. Detective Johnson supervised the evidence collection with methodical precision. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife from the Brannigan's own drawer, was carefully bagged and tagged. Blood samples were collected from multiple locations. Fingerprint powder dusted every surface that might yield a clue. The doctor arrived to examine Holly's body, his professional demeanor masking the weight of what he witnessed. Multiple stab wounds, he noted, suggesting rage rather than robbery. The attack was personal, intimate in its brutality. His preliminary findings would later confirm what investigators suspected: this was no random crime. As the investigation continued into the early morning hours, the absence of obvious evidence became increasingly troubling. Smudged fingerprints offered no clear matches. No valuables had been taken, no signs of struggle beyond the attack itself. The killer had known exactly where to find Holly and had left behind only questions. Outside, reporters from local news stations set up their equipment, preparing to deliver the story that would dominate headlines for weeks. The peaceful community of Bethlehem had been shattered, and everyone wanted answers. But answers, Detective Johnson was beginning to realize, might prove elusive in this case. Thursday morning brought a parade of police cars through Bethlehem's quiet streets as investigators began their door-to-door canvass. Detective Johnson and his team questioned neighbors, teachers, and classmates, searching for any detail that might illuminate Holly's final day. The stories they heard painted a picture of a typical teenager living a typical life. Holly had attended all her classes the previous day, laughing with friends between periods. She'd eaten lunch in the cafeteria, discussed weekend plans, showed no signs of distress or fear. Her teachers described her as bright, engaged, and optimistic about her upcoming graduation. Neighbors on Pine Top Trail reported nothing unusual. No strange cars, no unfamiliar faces, no sounds of distress from the Brannigan house. Mrs. Henderson had been gardening until 4 p.m. and saw nothing suspicious. The mail carrier had noticed Holly's car in the driveway during his afternoon rounds, but observed no other vehicles. The investigation expanded to Holly's social circle. Friends were interviewed about her relationships, her fears, any conflicts she might have mentioned, but Holly, it seemed, had no enemies. She dated occasionally, but wasn't involved in any dramatic relationships. She worked part-time at a local bookstore, where customers and coworkers alike described her as kind and trustworthy. As the interviews continued, Detective Johnson felt the frustration that would haunt him for decades. Every lead dissolved under scrutiny. Every potential witness had nothing to offer. Holly Brannigan had been killed by someone who moved through her world without leaving a trace. April arrived with the coroner's official report, confirming what everyone already knew but couldn't accept. Holly had died from multiple stab wounds, the attack occurring sometime between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. on March 28. The doctor's examination revealed the brutal reality: at least 7 wounds, inflicted with increasing force, suggesting an escalation of rage. The autopsy provided crucial details for the investigation. The knife wounds indicated the killer was likely right-handed and approximately Holly's height or taller. The pattern of injuries suggested she had tried to defend herself but was quickly overwhelmed. Most disturbing was the doctor's conclusion that the attack seemed personal rather than random, the work of someone who knew Holly well enough to access her home without suspicion. Detective Johnson studied the autopsy photos late into the night, searching for any detail that might provide a lead. The wounds told a story of violence and betrayal, but they couldn't name the perpetrator. Forensic science in 1979 had its limitations, and DNA analysis remained years in the future. Meanwhile, the community struggled to process their new reality. Churches held prayer vigils for Holly and her family. Radio stations dedicated songs to her memory. Parents began walking their children to school and locking doors that had remained open for generations. The sense of security that had defined Bethlehem had died with Holly Brannigan. Local newspapers ran daily updates on the investigation, but the headlines gradually shifted from hope to frustration. Police seek leads in Brannigan murder. No arrests in teen's death. Bethlehem killer still at large. The community's faith in quick justice began to waver. By May, the investigation had consumed thousands of man-hours and generated hundreds of pages of reports, but Detective Johnson found himself no closer to an arrest. The evidence room contained boxes of materials, photographs, fingerprint cards, witness statements, but no smoking gun that pointed to Holly's killer. The district attorney called a press conference to address growing public concern. Standing before a room packed with reporters and concerned citizens, she acknowledged the challenges facing the investigation while promising continued efforts. Her words were carefully chosen, balancing honesty about the lack of progress with reassurance that the case remained a priority. "We believe Holly knew her attacker," the district attorney stated, her voice steady despite the weight of the announcement. The lack of forced entry, the intimate nature of the crime scene, and the killer's apparent familiarity with the house all point to someone within Holly's social circle. "We are continuing to interview everyone who had contact with Holly in the days and weeks before her death." The press conference generated new tips from the public, but they led nowhere. Rumors began to circulate through Bethlehem's coffee shops and church gatherings. Suspicion fell on various individuals: a former boyfriend, a troubled classmate, a family acquaintance, but none could be substantiated with evidence. As spring turned to summer, Detective Johnson watched other cases demand his attention, while Holly's file grew thicker but not more conclusive. The investigation had reached an impasse, sustained only by determination and the haunting knowledge that somewhere in Bethlehem, a killer walked free. The 1980s passed in a blur of filed reports and frustrated dead ends. Detective Johnson, now graying at the temples, kept Holly's case file in his desk drawer, reviewing it whenever new techniques or technologies emerged. But fingerprint analysis could only do so much, and the physical evidence from 1979 yielded no new secrets. By 1985, the Brannigan case had officially gone cold. The file was transferred to a storage facility, joining hundreds of other unsolved crimes in Northampton County's archives. Holly's photograph, still showing her bright smile and optimistic eyes, was filed between pages of witness statements that had led nowhere. Detective Johnson retired in 1987, but not before ensuring that his successor understood the importance of the Brannigan case. "This one will stay with you," he warned the younger detective taking over his caseload. "Some cases solve themselves, others become part of who you are." The 1990s brought renewed hope with the formation of Northampton County's Cold Case Unit. Advanced forensic techniques, including early DNA analysis, offered the possibility of solving crimes that had stumped investigators for decades. Holly's case was among the first selected for review. Technicians carefully examined the knife that had taken Holly's life, looking for biological traces that 1979 technology couldn't detect. They tested clothing fibers, envelope seals, and household items that might have been touched by the killer, but preservation methods from the UN 1970s proved inadequate for the sensitive testing procedures now available. Contamination and degradation had compromised much of the evidence, leaving investigators with tantalizing possibilities but no definitive results. The new millennium brought sophisticated DNA analysis to the Brannigan investigation, raising hopes that science might finally provide the answers that traditional detective work had failed to uncover. Forensic laboratories in Harrisburg received boxes of evidence from Holly's case, each item carefully cataloged and tested using techniques that seemed like science fiction in 1979. The knife handle underwent extensive analysis. Technicians extracted microscopic samples from the grip, the blade, and the area where the killer's hand would have made contact. Initial tests showed promised biological material was present, but the samples were degraded after more than 2 decades in storage. Clothing items were subjected to fiber analysis and chemical testing. The lab examined Holly's sweater, looking for foreign DNA that might have been transferred during the attack. But cross-contamination from years of handling and storage had compromised the integrity of potential evidence. Each negative result felt like a personal failure to the new generation of investigators working the case. They understood that they might represent Holly's last chance for justice. As evidence continued to degrade with each passing year, the pressure was immense, but the science wasn't yet advanced enough to overcome the limitations of 1970s evidence preservation. True crime documentaries began featuring Holly's case, introducing her story to national audiences. Television producers interviewed Detective Johnson, now retired but still haunted by the unsolved murder. The publicity generated new tips, but they led to the same dead ends that had frustrated investigators for decades. The 2010s marked a renaissance in cold case investigations, driven by advances in genetic genealogy and microDNA analysis. When reporters from 6 ABC Philadelphia visited Bethlehem for the case's 35th anniversary, they found a community that had never forgotten Holly Brannigan but had largely accepted that her killer would never be caught. The district attorney's office agreed to extensive interviews about the case, hoping that renewed media attention might generate fresh leads. They displayed the evidence that had been tested repeatedly over the decades: the knife, Holly's clothing, household items that might have been touched by the killer. "We've used every available technology," the current district attorney explained to reporters. "Each advancement in forensic science has given us new hope, but we're working with evidence that wasn't preserved using modern standards. Some items have been tested so many times that there's very little material left to analyze." The interviews with Holly's family proved the most difficult to date. Watch. Her parents, now in their 70s, spoke with quiet dignity about their decades-long wait for justice. Their pain remained fresh despite the passage of time, their hope undiminished by countless disappointments. Online forums dedicated to true crime began featuring Holly's case prominently. Amateur investigators shared theories and analyzed evidence photos, but their enthusiasm couldn't overcome the fundamental challenges facing professional investigators. The case seemed destined to join the ranks of mysteries that time had rendered unsolvable. November 2019 brought the 40th anniversary of Holly's murder and another round of media coverage that felt more like a memorial than an investigation. The district attorney held a somber press conference, acknowledging the painful reality that had haunted the community for 4 decades. Despite our best efforts and the application of every available forensic technique, we have been unable to bring this case to a conclusion, she announced. The words hung in the air like a death sentence for hope itself. However, this case will never be closed. As technology continues to advance, we remain committed to seeking justice for Holly Branagan. The statement broke hearts throughout Bethlehem. Holly's mother wept openly as reporters asked about her feelings on the anniversary. Her brother, now middle-aged with children of his own, spoke about growing up in the shadow of an unsolved murder. The family's grace in the face of such prolonged anguish moved even hardened journalists to tears. But technology, as it turned out, wasn't finished with Holly's case. Advances in DNA recovery techniques were making it possible to extract genetic profiles from increasingly small and degraded samples. Non-profit organizations dedicated to solving cold cases were developing new tools that could recover DNA from sources previously thought to be useless. The announcement of failure would prove premature. Science, patient and relentless, was still working on Holly's behalf. In early 2024, hope arrived in the form of a partnership between the Northampton County Cold Case Unit and a non-profit forensic organization specializing in advanced DNA recovery. Their new DNA collection device could extract genetic material from microscopic traces that previous technology had missed entirely. The device was deployed on evidence that had been tested numerous times over the decades. Technicians worked with painstaking care, knowing they might have only one opportunity to recover usable material. The knife handle, Holly's clothing, and household items were subjected to the most advanced analysis available anywhere in the world. Bethlehem watched the development with cautious optimism. Too many promises had been broken, too many leads had dissolved into disappointment. But this felt different. The science was more sophisticated, the methodology more refined. If answers existed in the physical evidence, this might be humanity's best chance to find them. News crews returned to Pine Top Trail, interviewing neighbors who remembered the night Holly died. The house where she had lived looked much the same, though new owners had tried to erase the tragedy through renovation and landscaping. Still, the address carried weight in Bethlehem. Everyone knew what had happened there. The community prepared for another round of waiting, another test of their collective patience. But this time, the waiting would be shorter than anyone expected. The call came on a Tuesday evening in late March, 45 years to the week after Holly's murder. The forensic laboratory had recovered a DNA profile from biological material found on the knife handle, microscopic traces that had survived decades of storage and testing. The profile was partial but sufficient for comparison against national databases. When the technician ran the sample through the system, a match appeared on her computer. After nearly half a century, Holly Branagan's case finally had a suspect. The DNA belonged to someone who had lived in Bethlehem in 1979, someone who had known the Branagan family, someone who had left town shortly after the murder and never returned. The genetic evidence was strong enough to justify an arrest warrant, but investigators proceeded with extreme caution. They had one chance to get this right. Word of the development leaked within days, creating a media frenzy in Bethlehem. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, waiting for official confirmation. Social media exploded with speculation about the suspect's identity. The community that had waited so long for answers found itself on the verge of learning truths they weren't sure they were ready to hear. The district attorney called an emergency meeting with investigators and prosecutors. The case that had defined careers and haunted families was about to reach its climax. Justice, so long delayed, was finally within reach. The verification process took weeks as investigators confirmed the DNA match through multiple laboratories and built a genealogical profile to ensure they had identified the correct suspect. The genetic evidence was overwhelming, a match probability in the billions, but the prosecution team wanted absolute certainty before proceeding. The suspect had moved to another state decades earlier, building a new life far from Bethlehem and the crime that had shattered the community. Background checks revealed no subsequent criminal activity, no signs that this individual posed an ongoing threat to society. The killer had apparently lived quietly with their secret for 45 years. Meanwhile, investigators re-interviewed surviving witnesses and neighbors, comparing their decades-old recollections with the new evidence. One former neighbor recalled seeing an unexpected visitor at the Branagan house on the afternoon of the murder, a detail that had seemed unimportant at the time but now took on new significance. The emotional weight of the impending arrest affected everyone involved in the investigation. Detectives who had worked the case for decades found themselves simultaneously elated and exhausted. The district attorney struggled with the knowledge that justice would finally be served, but that it could never undo the decades of pain endured by Holly's family. As spring returned to Bethlehem, the community sensed that something momentous was about to happen. The case that had defined their collective memory for nearly 5 decades was approaching its conclusion. The arrest warrant was signed on a Friday morning, authorizing law enforcement to apprehend the suspect for Holly Brannigan's murder. The document represented the culmination of thousands of hours of investigation spanning multiple decades and generations of detectives. Judge Williams reviewed the evidence carefully before signing the warrant. The DNA match was conclusive, the chain of custody properly maintained, and the legal arguments sound. After 45 years, the judicial system was finally ready to seek justice for Holly Brannigan. News of the impending arrest spread quickly through Bethlehem. The local newspaper prepared a special edition. Television crews arrived from Philadelphia and New York. The community that had lived with questions for so long was about to receive answers. The suspect, unaware that decades-old science had finally caught up with their crime, was living quietly hundreds of miles away. They had no idea that microscopic traces of their DNA had survived on a knife handle, waiting for technology to advance sufficiently to reveal their identity. Coordination began between multiple law enforcement agencies for the arrest operation. Everything had to be perfect. There would be no second chances after waiting nearly half a century for this moment. By evening, the final preparations were complete. Tomorrow would bring justice for Holly Brannigan. Dawn broke gray and cold as Detective Martinez, the current lead investigator on Holly's case, prepared for the arrest that would define his career. Bethlehem police coordinated with law enforcement in the suspect's current state, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. The operation proceeded flawlessly. The suspect was taken into custody without incident, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning realization as charges were read. 45 years after killing Holly Brannigan, they were finally facing justice. News of the arrest exploded across Pennsylvania and beyond. Bethlehem cold case solved after 45 years. DNA technology catches killer decades later. Justice finally comes to Pinetop Trail. The headlines captured a story that seemed almost too set. Incredible to believe. The suspect's partial confession during initial questioning revealed knowledge of the crime that only the killer could possess, but they maintained their innocence regarding the place's actual murder. The confession was enough to confirm that authorities had the right person, even as legal battles loomed ahead. Social media erupted with reaction from Bethlehem residents and true crime enthusiasts worldwide. The case that had seemed unsolvable had finally been cracked through the persistence of investigators and the advancement of forensic science. But for Holly's family, the arrest brought complex emotion, relief mixed with renewed grief. Justice felt both triumphant and hollow after so many decades of waiting. The Northampton County District Attorney's Office worked around the clock to prepare for trial, assembling 4 decades of evidence into a coherent narrative that would convince a jury of the defendant's guilt. The challenge was immense. Witnesses had died, memories had faded, and physical evidence had degraded over time. The prosecution team, led by an experienced prosecutor who had handled numerous cold cases, focused on the DNA evidence as the cornerstone of their case. The genetic match was scientifically irrefutable, but they knew the defense would challenge every aspect of the evidence collection and testing procedures. Chain of custody documents were meticulously reviewed. Every person who had handled evidence over the decades was identified and interviewed. The prosecution prepared for challenges about contamination, degradation, and the reliability of testing decades-old samples. Meanwhile, the defense team began building their strategy around claims of mishandled evidence and the unreliability of genetic testing on severely degraded samples. They would argue that 45 years of storage and multiple testing procedures had compromised the integrity of the evidence. Public interest in the trial was enormous. Court officials prepared for unprecedented media attention and public scrutiny. The case had captured national attention as an example of how modern science could solve decades-old crimes. The judge assigned to the case, experienced in handling high-profile trials, established strict guidelines for media coverage and courtroom conduct. This would be a trial about science and justice, not spectacle. The trial opened on a crisp October morning, with the courthouse surrounded by news crews and crowds of observers. Holly's case had become a symbol of perseverance and the power of advancing technology to right old wrongs. The prosecutor's opening statement was masterful, weaving together decades of investigation with cutting-edge science. She walked the jury through Holly's final day, the discovery of her body, and the long journey toward justice. When she described the DNA evidence that had finally identified the killer, several jurors leaned forward with obvious interest. The defense attorney's opening painted a different picture, one of contaminated evidence, flawed procedures, and the dangers of convicting someone based on degraded genetic material that had been mishandled for decades. He argued that reasonable doubt should prevent conviction when the evidence was so old and potentially compromised. Exhibit tables displayed photographs from 1979 alongside modern DNA analysis reports. The contrast was stark. Crime scene photos that looked like historical documents next to colorful computer printouts showing genetic matches. The visual representation of time's passage was profound. Holly's family sat in the front row, their faces reflecting decades of pain and hope. They had waited 45 years for this moment, and their presence gave weight to every word spoken in the courtroom. The trial that would determine whether justice could truly be served after so much time had begun. The forensic expert took the witness stand on day 3 of the trial, carrying the weight of decades of scientific advancement on her shoulders. Her testimony would make or break the prosecution's case against Holly's accused killer. With clear, accessible language, she explained how modern DNA collection devices could recover genetic material from sources that were impossible to analyze in previous decades. The microscopic traces found on the knife handle had yielded a partial but sufficient genetic profile for comparison. The expert described the painstaking process of extracting usable DNA from evidence that had been stored for 45 years. Multiple laboratories had independently confirmed the results, eliminating any possibility of contamination or error. The probability that the genetic material belonged to someone other than the defendant was 1 in several billion. Cross-examination proved brutal, as the defense attorney challenged every aspect of the testing procedures. How could the expert be certain that the DNA hadn't been contaminated during decades of storage? How reliable were results from such degraded samples? Wasn't it possible that handling by numerous investigators over the years had compromised the evidence? The expert held firm under questioning, explaining that modern contamination protocols and multiple confirmatory tests had eliminated such possibilities. The science was sound, the procedures were rigorous, and the results were conclusive. When she stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Technology had spoken for Holly Brannigan, but would the jury listen? Holly's mother took the witness stand with quiet dignity, her voice barely above a whisper as she described her daughter's dreams and aspirations. She spoke of a young woman preparing for college, excited about her future, trusting in the safety of her own home. The emotional testimony brought tears to spectators' eyes and visible discomfort to the defendant, who looked away as Holly's mother described finding her daughter's body that terrible evening in 1979. The prosecutor asked gentle questions that revealed the human cost of the crime, not just Holly's death, but her family's decades of anguish. Holly's brother, now a man in his 60s, testified about growing up in the shadow of his sister's unsolved murder. He described how the family had never given up hope, never stopped believing that justice would eventually prevail. His words carried the weight of a lifetime spent waiting for answers. The defense attorney's cross-examination was respectful but pointed, noting that 45 years had elapsed since the crime and that memories could be unreliable after so much time. But the family's core testimony about Holly's character, her routines, her trust in those around her, remained unshaken. As Holly's mother left the witness stand, she glanced toward the defendant for the first time during the trial. The brief moment of eye contact conveyed more than any words could express a mother's enduring pain, meeting the gaze of her daughter's alleged killer. The closing arguments brought together all the threads of evidence, emotion, and time that had defined Holly Brannigan's case for 45 years. The prosecutor stood before the jury with confidence born of scientific certainty and moral conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "DNA doesn't lie. Time doesn't erase evidence, and justice doesn't have an expiration date." She methodically reviewed the genetic evidence, the chain of custody, and the multiple confirmations that had led to this moment. The defendant's DNA on the murder weapon was irrefutable proof of guilt. The prosecutor also revealed a final piece of evidence that had emerged during the investigation: genealogical research that further confirmed the defendant's connection to the crime. Family trees and genetic markers had provided additional corroboration beyond the initial DNA match. The defense attorney made one last attempt to raise doubt, arguing that the passage of time had made a fair trial impossible. Evidence had degraded, witnesses had died, and the defendant had been denied the right to a speedy trial through no fault of their own. How could justice be served when so much had been lost to time? But as both sides rested their cases, the weight of evidence seemed overwhelming. Holly Brannigan had waited 45 years to have her voice heard in a courtroom. Science had finally given her that voice, and it spoke with undeniable clarity about the identity of her killer. The jury deliberated for 18 hours across 2 days, carefully reviewing decades of evidence and grappling with the implications of convicting someone based on DNA evidence that was 45 years old. Their discussions were thorough, respectful, and ultimately unanimous. When they returned to the courtroom, the silence was deafening. Holly's family gripped each other's hands as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict that would end nearly 5 decades of uncertainty. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." The words echoed through the courtroom like thunder, followed by gasps, tears, and quiet applause. Holly's mother collapsed into her son's arms, decades of tension finally released. The defendant showed no emotion, staring straight ahead as the reality of conviction settled upon them. The jury foreman later told reporters that the DNA evidence had been decisive in their deliberations. While they acknowledged the unusual circumstances of such an old case, the science was too compelling to ignore. Multiple laboratories, multiple confirmations, and probability calculations in the billions had convinced them beyond any reasonable doubt. The defense attorney immediately announced plans for an appeal, arguing that the passage of time had made a fair trial impossible. But for the Brannigan family and the community of Bethlehem, the verdict represented a long-awaited victory for justice and persistence. Holly Brannigan's killer had finally been held accountable for their crime. 6 months after the verdict, Bethlehem held a memorial service on Pinetop Trail, not far from where Holly had died 46 years earlier. The gathering was both celebration and remembrance, honoring Holly's life while acknowledging the long journey toward justice. Detective Johnson, now in his 80s, attended the service with tears in his eyes. The case that had haunted his dreams for decades had finally reached its conclusion. He spoke briefly about Holly's impact on his life and career, noting that some victims never leave you, never stop demanding justice. The current district attorney announced that Holly's case would be used as a training example for cold case investigators nationwide. The successful combination of preserved evidence, advancing technology, and persistent investigation had created a template for solving other decades-old crimes. Holly's family established a scholarship in her name for students pursuing careers in forensic science. They wanted Holly's legacy to inspire future generations of investigators who might solve cases that seemed hopeless. Their daughter's death had meaning beyond the tragedy; it had advanced the cause of justice itself. As the memorial concluded, participants lit candles and placed them along Pinetop Trail. The flickering lights created a path of remembrance, honoring not just Holly, but all victims whose voices had been silenced by violence. The evening breeze carried their prayers into the Pennsylvania darkness, where justice had finally found its way home. The case was officially closed, but Holly Brannigan's story would continue to inspire those who refused to let time bury the truth.